What happens when a single decision sends shock waves through the global economy? When a political gamble turns into a financial catastrophe that no one saw coming, except those who now have to pay for it. Donald Trump built his brand on being a deal maker, a man who could outsmart the system and bend the world to America's advantage. But this time, the move that was supposed to secure dominance has backfired spectacularly. Exports are plummeting, foreign markets are shutting their doors, and boycotts are spreading like wildfire. What started as a show of strength has morphed into a dangerous economic storm, and the question no one wants to answer is this: who truly bears the cost of this chaos? Spoiler alert, it's not the politicians. It's the farmers, the manufacturers, the everyday citizens whose livelihoods depend on global stability. This is not just about trade, it's about trust, power, and the price of playing politics with the world's economy. When leaders take bold steps, the expectation is that these moves will cement their legacy as visionaries, not as cautionary tales. Trump's decision to impose aggressive trade restrictions was rooted in a philosophy of economic nationalism, an effort to protect domestic industries by forcing trading partners into submission. On paper, it sounded strong. It projected power. It promised to bring jobs back and secure America's economic throne. But here is the paradox of modern economics. What looks like strength in isolation often collapses when placed under the weight of global interdependence. The global economy is not a chessboard where one player can dominate by sheer will. It's an intricate web where every thread, when tugged, moves 100 others. When tariffs were imposed, they didn't just block imports, they triggered a silent chain reaction. Nations that once counted the U.S. as a reliable partner began reevaluating alliances, seeking alternatives, and in many cases, building new trade agreements that deliberately excluded American influence. The very relationships that took decades to cultivate were undone in a matter of months, not with a bang but with a ripple that grew into a tidal wave. And then came the numbers. Exports, which thrive on reciprocity and trust, began to decline. Farmers who once saw their goods flowing to international markets suddenly faced mountains of unsold produce. Manufacturing giants, once confident in steady overseas demand, started cutting jobs as contracts dried up. What was sold as a strategy to protect American jobs began eroding them from within. This wasn't just an economic issue, it became a psychological blow to a nation that prides itself on being the center of global trade. But the most striking aspect of this unraveling is how predictable it was. Economists warned that retaliatory measures would follow. They cautioned that global supply chains cannot be strong-armed without consequence. Yet, in the pursuit of political theater, these warnings were dismissed as fear-mongering. The reality we see now is not just about failed policy, it's about the illusion of control in a world that demands cooperation. Every bold decision carries a hidden cost. In this case, the cost was trust. The trust of international partners, the trust of businesses that believed in stability, and the trust of ordinary citizens who expected strength, but were handed uncertainty. And when trust breaks, markets don't just falter, they fracture. So, what's the lesson here? Power in the global arena isn't about imposing dominance, it's about sustaining relationships that keep the system moving. When leaders ignore that truth, they set in motion forces too vast to rein in. Remember this: the first casualty of economic arrogance isn't the policy. It's the people who believed in its promise. What happens when economic aggression meets global resistance? The answer is rarely victory, it's isolation. When Trump doubled down on tariffs and sanctions, the world didn't simply stand still, it moved. It adapted. And in many ways it retaliated, not always with counter-tariffs, but through something even more profound: boycotts. These weren't random acts of protest, they were calculated, symbolic, and deeply psychological. Nations and consumers began to make choices that spoke louder than diplomatic statements. They stopped buying American. They turned to alternative suppliers. And in that silent shift, a powerful message echoed across the globe. What can live without you? Boycotts have always carried a moral weight, far beyond their economic impact. They don't just block a transaction, they erode influence. They tell the world that loyalty is conditional, that trust can fracture under pressure. And once that fracture begins, the ripple effect is relentless. Markets that were once America's stronghold became fertile ground for emerging powers. China, the European Union, even smaller economies saw an opening, and they seized it. New trade agreements were signed, strategic partnerships were forged, and every handshake outside Washington's reach weakened America's grip on the very system it once designed. This is the irony of hyper-nationalism in a global economy. In trying to stand alone, you invite others to stand together, without you. The boycotts didn't just dent export numbers, they rewired the global trade map. Supply chains that once ran through U.S. corridors now stretch across Asia, Europe, and Africa, bypassing American ports entirely. And once these new routes are established, they don't vanish when the storm passes. They endure. Because trust once lost is not easily rebuilt. What's even more striking is the psychological dimension of these boycotts. They weren't born out of necessity. They were acts of defiance, of reclaiming dignity against economic bullying. When countries feel coerced, they rebel, not just politically, but economically. And that rebellion doesn't stay contained, it becomes a narrative, a story that spreads. We don't need America as much as America needs us. That narrative is dangerous because it shifts the perception of power. Influence in global politics has never been just about military might, it's about economic interdependence. When that web loosens, empires weaken, not with war, but with quiet withdrawal. So here's the uncomfortable truth: boycotts don't simply hurt profits, they redefine relationships. They turn allies into opportunists and competitors into leaders. And the more they grow, the more they reveal a lesson we've seen throughout history. That dominance without diplomacy is a fragile illusion. You can't bully your way into lasting power, you have to earn it through trust and reciprocity. Remember this: in a connected world, isolation isn't strength, it's surrender in slow motion. And the cost is paid not in headlines but in the quiet shift of power you no longer control. The collapse of exports is not just a statistic, it's a chain reaction, and the first link always breaks close to home. When shipments stop moving, when contracts go unfulfilled, the impact doesn't linger in the abstract world of graphs and charts, it shows up in people's lives. It shows up in the factory worker clocking out for the last time, in the small business owner staring at unsold inventory, in the community that once thrived on the steady hum of trade now echoing with silence. Every economy is a network of trust, and exports are its lifelines. They carry not only goods but the promise of stability, the assurance that production here has a purpose elsewhere. When that purpose disappears, confidence evaporates, businesses pull back, investments stall, and unemployment, once a distant fear, becomes an unavoidable reality. For every container that sits idle, there is a family recalculating its future. A community wondering if tomorrow will look anything like yesterday. But the damage isn't purely economic, it's psychological. Prosperity isn't just about wealth, it's about momentum. When people believe in progress, they build, they innovate, they risk. When that belief falters, they retreat, they hoard instead of spending, they hold back instead of expanding. This creates a self-fulfilling spiral. Fear breeds stagnation, stagnation deepens fear. And soon the narrative changes. The country that once projected strength begins to question its own resilience. For leaders, this moment is perilous because credibility is the currency of governance. It's easy to promise greatness, it's harder to deliver it when the ground beneath people's feet feels unstable. Political rhetoric may deflect for a while, but you cannot spin empty shelves or shuttered factories. People don't vote based on speeches. They vote based on the weight of their grocery bags, the size of their paychecks, the security of their children's future. And when those things shrink, so does faith in leadership. There is also a philosophical layer to this crisis. Export collapse exposes a truth we often ignore: no nation, no matter how powerful, exists in isolation. We trade not just because it's profitable, but because it's necessary. Trade is the bridge between self-interest and shared prosperity. When you burn that bridge in the name of sovereignty or pride, you discover that isolation is not independence, it is vulnerability disguised as strength. So as exports dwindle and consequences mount, the question isn't who is to blame. The real question is, who will adapt? History does not reward those who cling to illusions of control, it rewards those who face reality and act before it's too late. Here's the bottom line: when trade stops, time starts running out. And in that race, the cost of pride is always paid by the people. What we are witnessing now is not just a disruption in trade. It's a reconfiguration of the global order. Every tariff, every sanction, every retaliatory measure sends ripples far beyond the balance sheets of corporations. It alters relationships, reshapes alliances, and redefines what power means in the 21st century. For decades, global economics operated under an unspoken agreement: interdependence would deter conflict. Trade was the great stabilizer, the quiet diplomat that bound nations together in mutual need. But when that glue weakens, the cracks don't just appear in commerce, they spread into geopolitics. A trade war is not a series of isolated economic skirmishes, it's a stress test for the architecture of power. Nations ask themselves, who stands with us when supply chains fracture? Who can be trusted when agreements become weapons? Old alliances built on convenience start to crumble when economic pressure forces countries to choose sides. And in that vacuum, New partnerships emerge, often between nations once considered rivals, united not by ideology, but by necessity. This is why the narrative of self-reliance, though appealing in its simplicity, is dangerously incomplete. True sovereignty is not about isolation, it's about influence. And influence requires engagement. When a country turns inward, thinking it can wall itself off from global shocks, it discovers that isolation doesn't insulate, it exposes. Because while one nation retreats, others advance, forging new trade routes, writing new rules, and setting new norms. Power abhors a vacuum, and in geopolitics, vacuums are always filled, never left empty. There's a deeper philosophical truth here: the struggle for dominance has shifted from armies to economies. The wars of this century are not fought with tanks on battlefields but with tariffs, currency valuations, and access to technology. Economic warfare is the new Cold War, and every trade dispute is a proxy battle for global influence. The question is no longer who has the largest arsenal, but who controls the most strategic supply chains, who dominates critical technologies, who can withstand economic shocks without fracturing. And so, the collapse of exports and the escalation of boycotts are not just domestic problems. They are signals of a broader transformation. The map of global power is being redrawn, not with borders and treaties, but with pipelines, shipping lanes, and digital networks. Those who understand this will shape the next era. Those who ignore it will be shaped by it, often harshly. The ultimate cost of misreading this moment is not just economic decline, it is irrelevance. In a world where influence flows through commerce, to lose your grip on trade is to lose your voice in the conversations that decide the future. That is the reality leaders must face, and face quickly. Because history doesn't pause for hesitation. And here is the truth you must carry with you: when power shifts, it does not announce itself. It moves silently, while everyone else is still arguing about yesterday's rules.